in Second Corinthians, just barely. We're kind of coming to a close here, but Second Corinthians chapter 12. Paul is engaged in Second Corinthians chapter 12, is engaged in what we might call this reluctant boasting. And again, we're a little bit of a disadvantage in the written word. I think if we were writing this today, we would put boasting in those quotation marks. And if Paul was speaking today, he would do the air quotes, boasting, because it's really defending himself. But he does, I think, does two things, or one of two things. He says that simply that this defense, and he just simply calls it boasting because it's going to come across as boasting. It's almost inevitable that any self defense may come across as boasting. But then it's also possible that Paul is just boasting to just kind of shame them, that you should have done this, you should have come to my defense. And so I'm going to kind of egg it on a little bit to just show you, to maybe embarrass you that I'm having to do this. And so we got a little bit of that. Um, the reluctant part comes in chapter 12, with their verses 1 through 6. We talked about this last time, about this man, he says, this man in Christ who 14 years ago had this vision. And whether they actually transported to heaven, Paul says, I'm not sure, or whether it was just a spiritual vision. And almost all scholars, in fact, I don't know that I read any scholar that doesn't think this is Paul talking about himself. And I think that becomes evident when we get to verse 7, that he is talking about himself, but does so in the third person to kind of mitigate or to limit the boasting part of it. And so he says now in verse 7, after talking about again this man who has this vision, again, verse 7, I think, is going to clear it up who that man was, lest I should be exalted above measure by the abundance of the revelation. So I think that seems clear then. If there's any question, we go, oh, okay, then that was Paul talking about himself, because he says, uh, lest I be exalted by these revelations. He says, a thorn in the flesh was given to me. A thorn in the flesh. I couldn't find anything that could help us. Was that a common expression in that day? I would assume probably it was, but I couldn't find anything to back that up or not. But this thorn in the flesh was given to me. As we read along, he's going to call it weakness. He's going to call it his infirmity. Um, maybe a reproach down in verse 10. But it becomes evident to us, I think, that this is some kind of physical malady that he is dealing with. Max?
Do you think when he woke up from this vision, why he had this thorn in the flesh like that? Or was it something that he thought? I had always kind of assumed that it was something that, oh, well, that's how come this has happened. I have to keep me, but, I wondered what your thoughts were on that.
Well, that's all it is a thought, and I'll have to get over here in my opinion box, because that's all. I've always just assumed that it was just some unrelated physical malady, but it very well could have been. As we know, an earlier incident, it's not this incident because the 14 years doesn't line up, but when Paul received the vision on the road to Damascus, he was blinded. So it's not out of the question that a physical malady can attach to a spiritual vision. Again, that's not what he's referencing here, that particular incident, because that was more than 14 years ago from when he wrote this. But there is a connection sometimes, and so could be. But like I said, I've always just assumed that this was unrelated. I can't prove it one way or the other, though. Now, the $64,000 question is, what was it? What was that thorn in the flesh? And we want to know, and I'm going to talk just a little bit, just because it's fun, about what I think it might be. I don't know, but I think there's maybe some hints as to what it could be. But before we do that, it is possible that Paul speaks in these vague terms, doesn't tell us what it is, other than I think again, the language here uh, almost demands that it's some physical ailment that he's dealing with. Is that maybe he does it so that we can all relate to it? Because if it was something, a physical condition that you don't have, you'd think, well, okay, that doesn't apply to me. I don't relate. But since it's vague, we all have some kind of thorn in the flesh, some kind of, at some point in our lives, we will, or our loved ones will have some kind of physical malady, and it we makes it, maybe that's why he does it. But all right, just for the fun of it, I can't prove anything, and this is all. I'm going to stand over here, but just pretend I'm in my opinion box for all of this. Hold your finger here and go to the book of Galatians. Galatians chapter 4. And I'll ask for a couple volunteers. Galatians 4, someone read verse 15.
What then has become of your brethren? For I testify to you that if possible, you would have gouged out your eyes and given them to me.
Okay, again, more speculation. Why would people have pulled out their eyes to give them to Paul? Would that have been just kind of a fun gift to get? Or is that maybe indicating a physical malady? I think maybe the idea here is, and obviously Paul is not talking seriously. Paul knows that in first century there was no such thing as an eye transplant. It wouldn't have done any good. But he was saying you would have, if that would have worked, you would have plucked your eyes out and gave them to me. Kind of almost sounds like Paul has an eye problem, doesn't it? Stay in Galatians chapter 6, and this time somebody read verse 11.
These what large letters I have written to you with my own hand.
What large letters I have written. And again, we don't know, but why would somebody write in big print? Well, maybe because uh, today we have books. I can remember used to, and the Reader's Digest still come out. I don't know if it still does or not, but remember there used to be two versions of Reader's Digest: the Reader's Digest, and then there was the big print for people who had eyesight problems. And so maybe Paul is writing. And so Galatians, there's two hints in the book of Galatians that sound like maybe Paul had eye problems, some kind of eyesight problem. Again, I can't prove that. And if I could prove that in the book of Galatians, I can't prove that that's what the thorn in the flesh was. But if there's anything in Paul's writings that give us a hint, that's it. Now take that for what it's worth. So some kind of thorn in the flesh. Again, back to speculation, mindless speculation. Was this a natural occurring thing? Or it certainly might have been related to some of his persecution. You can see that in a stoning and in beatings with rods and whips, that there's high likelihood you go through enough of that that maybe one of those could have affected an eye or both eyes. Larry?
Life, if you ever gotten a thorn in your leg or something, traipsing through the woods or whatever, it hurts and it's awful, but it's not going to leave you bedridden for months. It doesn't keep you from doing what you need to do.
Yeah.
And whatever he had, didn't stop him.
Yeah, good
It
point.
was a constant source of pain and irritation, and he really wanted to get rid of it, but it didn't keep him from doing what he needed to do.
You always know it's there, that thorn in the flesh or that splinter is what I maybe relate it to. But yeah, that's a good point. Max?
Which kind of Judaizing teachers, anti-Paul.
Oh, yeah.
But, that would be a real pain in the side to have to put up with those guys.
Yeah, it very well could be something. To me, that the language sounds like it's a fleshly, but yeah, Paul would have had, and to that point, you could make a list of possible thorns in the flesh, couldn't he? The Judaizing teachers, these opponents in Corinth, which may have been Judaizing teachers. We've seen some maybe hints of that, and there's some different things that he had throughout. And so this thorn in the flesh was given to me. Now, um, that may be literal, that may be accommodative language. Was given to me. Sometimes the scriptures speak of things that, and I'm not necessarily talking about this because he's going to use a different language here, that God did this. And, it's like God sends the rain upon the just and the unjust. Does that mean that every time it rains, God's up there controlling some switches? Okay, it's going to rain in Joplin and it's going to skip Neosho today. Or does that just mean that God has set the meteorological cycle in order, that God didn't literally, well, God literally sent the rain, but not in the sense that he said it's going to rain today starting at 3:15 in this location. And so the fact that he says it was given to me doesn't necessarily have to mean that he was zapped with it. Now it might. We just don't know. Again, that language sounds one way, but can really be interpreted a couple of different ways. Nick?
Same speculation a little, but I wonder if it could maybe be a leftover side effect from being blinded, or on the road to Damascus, and if that was just a little something that God left him to keep him humble and remind him of that experience, as he's going out teaching.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a possibility. Certainly, I could see that. But he identifies it as a messenger of Satan. And so it was given to me as a messenger of Satan. Again, I would argue that doesn't necessarily mean that Satan zapped him with this, that he's just seeing this as, and that's a possibility. I'm not saying that didn't happen, but it's also a possibility that he's just saying that this is, like all physical maladies, a indirect result of sin and the curse of sin, and therefore it's a messenger of Satan. Uh, I find it interesting, though, that he doesn't blame God. It's a messenger of Satan, not a messenger of God, although he seems to indicate that God is using this malady to humble him. John?
Kind of like Job.
Yeah.
The devil was allowed to inflict Job to test him, to see if he would curse God, and God let him do it just to see, like, okay, I'm willing to let you do this.
Right.
Saying it's true. If Job's actually gonna, if he's gonna curse me because I've hedged him in and kept him from harm, it's not the same, but
Yeah. No, there may be a correlation there. I find it interesting in Job, though, that it seems that through the entire story of Job, Job is never privy of that conversation that this was Satan doing it. Job always attributes it to God. Job and his friends think God is doing this or God's allowing it, which is certainly true. But God never says, wait a minute, that was Satan that did that when God finally speaks. But yeah, maybe a correlation there.
really close to it. He was really smart. He was really educated and knowledgeable, and he studied to be a preacher, and he spent hours and hours studying the Bible all the time at night. And he also had, like, he would get hit, like he got hit by a car once, and he just had health problems, and we talked about it, and he kind of wondered if it was just God giving him a thorn in the flesh to keep him humble, because he had so much power, in
Hmm.
his knowledge and his ability to teach and preach, and kind of wondered if that was a thorn in the flesh for him, to keep him humble.
Yeah.
Who
Yeah.
have so much ability. It can look what happens to people, when they have so much ability, they can get carried away
Yeah,
with it.
yeah, with that arrogance. So yeah, so that's why I'm thankful that I'm dumb and talentless. That only good stuff happens to me. So, but he says, here's this messenger of Satan sent to, the New King James says, to buffet me. And that just means to, Paul would use that language elsewhere, it just means to beat me, to inflict harm on me, lest I be exalted above measure. Now, again, there's two ways of interpreting this, all of this. And that is that God is in a situation like Job. God is letting Satan inflict this directly on Paul. The other way of interpreting it, and I would probably lean toward this second interpretation, that Paul is using, again, accommodative language. He's not saying that this was intended, it was given to me so that I would be humble, but that was a result of it. Does that make sense? That he's not saying that God said, "Oh, you're getting a little arrogant. Satan, sick him, beat him down a little bit." But it's just that this thing, it can naturally be used to do that. That more in the providence of God is another way of saying that. Concerning this thing, again, Paul is being vague. Now, I say he's being vague. Again, back to my old tired analogy of we're reading letters in Grandma's attic, that we don't know all the story. Do you think maybe the Corinthians knew what it was? I would assume they probably did. Paul's close relationship with them, he'd spent so much time with them. They probably knew. So that maybe that's why he's vague, is just because I didn't need to say what it was. What my thorn in the flesh is. So concerning this thing, I pleaded with the Lord 3 times that it might depart from me. And this is to Larry's point, that this is the thorn, that something he wanted rid of. Like Larry pointed out, it didn't stop him from doing his apostolic work, but it was enough of annoyance that 3 times he pleaded. That's begging. I begged God 3 times that it might depart from me. But he said to me, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my strength is made perfect in weakness." And so God answered that prayer, kind of like our sermon last Sunday, but said no. Now, again, I don't want to make a big deal about this because, again, I don't know. Two possible ways I think of interpreting that. Number one is it is possible, probably likely, that God did speak to Paul and say those words. Paul was inspired of God. We know that God communicated with the apostles and prophets in those days. But is it also possible Paul is saying this is the message? Since it didn't go away, then this is my interpretation of God's silence. I think that's possible. I, I think it's more likely that God did speak to him, and in some sense it doesn't matter. But just for full disclosure's sake, my grace is sufficient for you, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. Now, that could be just a broad statement, but it may relate to what he had said earlier in this epistle and early in First Corinthians, when he talked about how that he did not come with great excellence of speech and oratory, so that your faith wouldn't be in me, but in the message. And so is it kind of that idea again? Strength is made perfect in weakness. Is that number one, it was made perfect and it kept me humble. I would not have been an effective evangelist and apostle if I was arrogant and full of myself. And so that made the strength more perfect. But also just in the idea that it became that it's all about Jesus. It's not about the gospel, not about me. And so in that sense, the strength is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, most gladly, I will rather boast about my infirmities. And so if I'm going to boast, I'm going to boast about my weaknesses. And so that man went into heaven and saw that vision, but I have a thorn in the flesh. No mistaking about who has the thorn in the flesh. We can debate who had that vision, but there's no debate about who had the thorn in the flesh. So I'll boast about my infirmities. Larry?
Statement on strength is made perfect in weakness. That's kind of God's MO. That's a lot of times when he operates, he likes to choose a vessel that's not that impressive, so you focus on what's in the vessel. And Acts chapter 4, verse 13, now when they saw the boldness of Peter and John, perceived their uneducated and untrained men, marveled. You know, and when you have these uneducated fishermen inspired speaking, these lofty things
Hmm.
that they shouldn't know, it's obvious God's at work. And you think that Gideon happened to send half his army home, so the victory was obviously a miracle, or the walls of Jericho.
Yeah, I was thinking about the walls of Jericho.
That's completely unimpressive. And it seems like maybe whatever the thorn was, he picked Paul, who had the thorn and had a lisp and, wasn't impressive physically and all that. But the things coming out of his mouth were like, wow, and so everyone knew it was.
They got to be something else besides him. Yeah, yeah, good point. Therefore, most gladly, I will rather boast of my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. Rest upon him and be seen in him. Again, to that point, that it was just obvious that this man is working by the power of God. He is not just this wise, powerful superhero that can do everything. And so it has to be God. Again, to Larry's point, the walls of Jericho thing, that had to be. That's not a military strategy that's ever worked in defeating a city. So it had to be something else at work. Therefore, verse 10, I take pleasure in infirmities, in reproaches, in needs, in persecutions, in distresses for Christ's sake. That's a language that's repeated often in Scripture, and I think it needs some clarification. Well, maybe it doesn't, because I think we all understand what's being said. Paul is obviously not saying, I take pleasure in infirmities. He's not saying, oh, I love a thorn in the flesh. I wish I had two of them, because he'd already said, I begged God 3 times to have it removed. And so this isn't some kind of mental illness where he enjoys pain and enjoys this infirmity and enjoys the attention that you get when you have some kinds of physical infirmity. That's not what he's saying. That's not what James is saying. That's not what Peter is saying in their writings. They all say similar things. And so we understand what they are saying is, I can see some benefit in it. Now, I wanted it gone. And so I didn't delight in it that much. I begged God 3 times for it to be gone. But if it's got to be here, then I'm going to make the best of it, as we would say. I'm going to see the benefit of it. And the benefit of it is that it keeps me humble. And that's why I would argue that all of this is, for lack of a better word, coincidental. I don't think this is Satan or God, either one, intentionally zapping Paul with this infirmity, but that it's just happened and God is using it. Paul is using it, that this will keep me humble and this will, again, glorify God, that this is a God thing, that this man is able to do this. And so that's the approach that we take there. He does it. All of these are for Christ's sake. Now, again, I'm giving you a lot of options here, ways to interpret things. He says, I take pleasure in infirmities, in reproaches, in needs, in persecutions, in distresses for Christ's sake. And so here's the question, and it doesn't really change anything. What does for Christ's sake modify? Does it modify the pleasure that he takes in it? And I would probably argue that that's the way he means it. I'm taking pleasure for Christ's sake. I'm not taking pleasure, oh boy, I'm glad I got a thorn in the flesh, but I'm glad that I can use this thorn in the flesh to glorify Christ. Or is he saying that the infirmities, the persecutions, the distresses are for Christ's sake? Now, certainly the persecutions and distresses were, but is he saying this? So again, if he's saying it that way, then I would argue this thorn in the flesh, whatever it is, wasn't just some natural disease that he got, that it was a result of some persecution. Again, you don't have to interpret it that way. The for Christ's sake may apply to the taking pleasure in. I hope all that makes sense there. John?
Yeah, Peter and some of the other apostles were flogged and received lashes for preaching the word in the beginning when the church was first established, and they rejoiced for being persecuted for Christ's sake. It wasn't like they didn't take enjoyment in the pain, but they rejoiced that they were worthy. I think that's what it says.
Yeah, they were worthy of
They
that.
were found worthy to suffer for Christ's sake.
Yeah. And I use it again, no illustration is perfect. Don't misunderstand me. But I use the analogy to that point of of a veteran wearing a Purple Heart pin on his lapel or something. He's taking, there's some honor in that. And he's not bragging that I got shot or I got hurt or whatever. You know, that was great. Not saying that, but there's some honor that he got wounded for a noble cause. You know, we've all got wounded for stuff that we're embarrassed about. You know, that something you were doing with a knife or climbing on a kitchen chair when you should have used the ladder and you hurt yourself and you're almost embarrassed when somebody says, "What happened?" Well, you know, uh, or some tomfoolery when you were a kid doing certain things explains these scars, but not for the Purple Heart recipient. He's got scars, but he's wearing a pin that says, because it was for a worthy cause. And so, yes, those apostles, Paul himself, they take pleasure in it because it humbles them, it glorifies Christ, but also that they got to share in the sufferings of Christ. And there's some honor and some almost prestige in that, certainly. Adam?
10 and 11, blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when they revile and persecute you and say all kinds of evil against you falsely for my sake. Rejoice and be exceedingly glad, for great is your reward in heaven, for so they persecuted the prophets who were before you.
Yeah.
Saying this for the sake of a good thing.
Yeah.
For the sake of Christ, his sake.
Yeah. Yeah. There's again, we can make a list of why we take pleasure in those, and there's a couple things in the Beatitudes of why they persecute, get you, put you in good company, so they persecuted the prophets, and your rewards in heaven. So, Danny.
The results for Christ. We can't deny that. And I think about the scripture where Paul told them it was better for them that he be here than to go on and be with Christ.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a similar thing. And so here's the challenge for us. What weaknesses do we have that we can use to glorify God? Or use an excuse. Yeah, there's the other side of that. We often do the opposite. Well, I would go on those missionary journeys, but I've got this thorn in the flesh, you know. And to Larry's point earlier, it didn't stop Paul. He didn't use it as an excuse. You know, we might be tempted to use it in that way, but he was using it in a way to glorify God. Um, good friend who was a gospel preacher. In fact, he was my college roommate. He's passed away since, but um, I, I, I and others have likened him to a modern day Job. Shane was his name, and he just had a rough life in a lot of ways. He didn't get married until late in life, and then as soon as he got married, not shortly after that, his wife was diagnosed with cancer, and went through two bouts of cancer, and they were only married 7 years before she passed away, finally from that cancer. But Shane, to his credit, used that uh, and preached lessons, and actually series of lessons about grief. How does a Christian deal with grief? He kind of became an expert on the book of Job, in the idea of suffering and those kind of things, and used that negative in his life as a way to glorify God. And so there's the challenge for us, and we're not necessarily in saying you had to go preach a series of lessons all over the country, but you can use a weakness even to glorify God. And we talk about, in fact, we'll even talk about in our sermon this morning, using a strength. You know, you've got this talent, this ability. Then certainly Scripture would say you need to use that talent, that ability, that gift. You use that to glorify God. Well, that one's, I think, more obvious to us. But I think now Paul is telling us, how can you use your weakness to glorify God? You can, by helping, serving others, if nothing else.
See,
Yeah.
Paul, people that experience the same weaknesses, that he can be on their level to be able to communicate to them.
Yeah. And that is certainly a way that we can use our weakness. And we need to use our spiritual weaknesses that way. We need, and I think that was part of the point of Jesus trying to get the Pharisees to see that they too were sinners. When Jesus said, Jesus was criticized for letting the publicans and sinners come to him by these arrogant Pharisees who thought they had never done anything wrong to anger God. He says the sick have need of a physician, not the well. Well, he wasn't saying the Pharisees didn't need a physician. They did. They needed a surgeon to remove all that was wrong with them. But his point was they recognize their sickness and their weakness. The Pharisees didn't. And so one thing we can do is recognize our spiritual weakness. And so when someone comes confessing sin, we can relate to that. Yes, I too am a humble sinner, forgiven by God. Not like, oh, well, how dare you? We don't want you in our group. You know, you were the dirty sinner. No, we can relate to that weakness on a spiritual as well as physical.
I think that's the reason we can understand the importance of everybody in a congregation. Everybody has different weaknesses.
Yeah.
But as a whole, we should communicate
Yeah, absolutely.
something.
Right, right. And something sadly too many churches don't have. But that's certainly Jesus' goal. It should be ours. For when I am weak, then I am strong. I think again we understand that contradiction, that irony there. That this has made me. I think not to put words in Paul's mouth, but I think this is the idea that it's made me a better Christian. It's made me a better servant of God. That's the only sense in which we can make sense of the idea that weakness makes us stronger. Well, that may, and I think we can all, if we're honest, and if you've lived long enough and had enough, garbage in your life, we can all look back and say, I wouldn't want to go through that again, but it made me stronger. It made me better. If nothing else, as Jeff and Danny said, it's now made me where I can sympathize with others who are going through it, and I can serve them in that sense. All right, verse 11 now. I have become a fool in boasting. And so he just comes out. He's been kind of hinting around, or maybe more than hinting around, about the idea of the boasting and the foolishness. Now he just comes out and says it. I've become a fool in boasting. You have compelled me. And so again, I would argue that this isn't just Paul defending himself that comes across as boasting. I think that's largely it. But I think there's also some idea of Paul is, accentuating that a little bit to shame them. You compelled me to do this, for I ought to have been commended by you. For in nothing was I behind the most eminent apostles, though I am nothing. And so there's a lesson here, and the lesson is that we need to come to the defense of others. We could make that argument about our spiritual leaders, but really just about any. Now that doesn't mean, and I hope I wouldn't even need to make this clarification, but if somebody's done wrong, Paul is not saying defend the fornicator that was in your midst in 1 Corinthians 5. No. But if somebody is worthy of our defense, then we need to come to their defense. We need to do that for them. We need to stand up for them and to be counted. I want to give you a real life illustration of this. When I was a young, probably middle schooler, where I was going to church, we had a preacher that, for whatever reason, I was just a kid, so I don't know all the details of it, but there was a faction of the congregation that didn't like him. In fact, really didn't like him and wanted him gone. And he had done nothing wrong as far as in his teaching or anything else, but you know how it is. They just got some sore heads there, and they didn't want him as our preacher anymore. And I don't know, again, I was just a kid, if this was the reason behind it, but he decided to move. And where he was going to go was where there wasn't a church. He was going to try to go start a work in this part of the country that was neglected and needed some work. And so when he wanted to go do that, guess who was championing the idea of supporting him financially? It was those soreheads that wanted him gone. And so, we want you gone so bad. We'll pay you not to preach here, basically. It was the idea. And so they're just like, yes, we'll support you. How much money do you need to leave town, basically? And so that was kind of the thing going on in this congregation, and it was just this, that, and the other. And it kind of this rumblings and grumblings underneath. And I'll never forget one Sunday morning when the invitation was offered, my grandpa went forward. And I need to tell you a little bit about my grandpa. His name was Ithema Swilling Duke. And I get my size from him. My dad's side of the family, we're all little. My mom's side of the family, there's not a runt in the bunch. We're all big and big people. And so my grandpa is this big, uh, intimidating kind of presence. But my grandpa was not the guy to be out in front of everybody. He never led singing. He never gave a talk or a sermon. He was just kind of a behind the scenes kind of guy. But he came forward not to confess sin, but he asked the preacher, and of course the preacher gladly gave him the floor. And my grandpa got up and gave a speech defending that preacher and saying, I want it on the record. We didn't have elders, we just had business meetings, that I was fully in favor of supporting him in this new work, but not because I want to get rid of him, but because I think he's done a good work for us. He'll do a good work for him. And he said, shame on anybody else that has other motives. And he sat down, and that just kind of, and I mean, my grandpa was always my hero. But after that day, I wanted to stand up and go, yeah, grandpa, you tell him. But there's the idea of what Paul was saying. You should have done that. When these people were starting this, well, Paul, is he really an apostle? And he did doing all that. He's not Peter. No, somebody, he says, should have stood up and said, hush. Paul is and that's what Paul is saying. You've made me look like a fool. You should have done this. It doesn't look foolish when somebody else says, he's a great guy. Where would we be without him? But if I stood up and said, I'm a great guy, where would you be without me? It comes across a little different, doesn't it? And so you do that when it's needed and called for. Nick?
Called to do good. And to do good doesn't mean just not doing bad.
Yeah.
Two different things. Thing comes to my mind when you see all these things where some people just want to video something. Something bad is happening to someone. Well, their thing they're going to do about it is just video instead of helping.
Yeah.
It would be to do good. I didn't do bad. I didn't attack. I'm not the one attacking them. I'm just watching it. But you also didn't do good to help the person. And there's different. That's kind of what Paul's saying. You didn't go ahead and go the next step and do the good thing and defend me when you knew they were lying
No.
and everything.
Not enough to say, well, I didn't say that about Paul. Well, but you didn't object to it either. And so, yeah, excellent point. And I think there's a whole sermon in there, isn't there? The idea of kind of being half a Christian. And there's no such thing, obviously, as half a Christian. But you think about Paul's list a lot of times. Paul will make these lists. These people will not inherit the kingdom of heaven. Basically saying, don't do this. Here's a list of things don't do. But almost always, what does he follow it up with another list? Here are what you need to be. These are the fruits of the Spirit, are the fruit of the Spirit, are here's what a child of God ought to do. And we're pretty good about the do not do, but we're only half a Christian if we didn't put on these other things. And so, yeah, that's a good point. And so I ought to be defended by you. Truly, let's see if we can finish this section here. Verse 12, truly the signs of an apostle were accomplished among you. And so again, maybe the hint is people were questioning the authenticity of him being an apostle. Well, hey, the signs of an apostle were done among you with all perseverance and signs and wonders and mighty deeds. So there's the proof, God's proof that I am who I said I was. For what is it in which you were inferior to other churches? And I think the implication is other churches serviced by other men, by other apostles. What did you miss out on? What spiritual gift did you not get? What teaching of truth did you not receive? What salvation did you miss out on because I was your apostle? And the obvious answer is none. For what was I inferior to other churches, except that I myself was not burdensome to you? Now, I think the burdensome here, we'll attach it to other Paul's writings, the idea that I did not receive financial uh, pay from you. Let's use that term. And so I think, again, reading the letters in Grandma's attic, we can maybe assume that that was an argument some were making. Well, Paul's not even a real preacher. We didn't even pay him. A real preacher gets a paycheck, and we didn't pay him, so he's not a real preacher, or he wasn't full time preacher. He did that tent making on the side, and so he's not a real. And Paul says that's the only thing you missed out on was having to write me a paycheck. And I think we can see tongue firmly in his cheek when he says, "Forgive me this wrong. I'm so sorry that I didn't take money from you." And again, I think that's high sarcasm in that. You didn't miss out on anything other than that. And so why are you listening to these silly, disparaging comments about me?
Want to accomplish this, but he didn't think about it ever not accomplishing the right thing that didn't make them feel a part of because they weren't, helping.
Yeah, yeah. I think you're exactly right. Paul thought he was doing a good and was doing a good thing by not becoming a burden to them, to use his language here. But they turned it around, and isn't that the way it goes? Evil people, or maybe not even maybe evil is too strong of a word, but the people can take a good thing you did and twist it into something bad. You can make that do a bad thing, but you can manipulate things in that such a way. And so Paul, again, coming to his own defense. All right, we'll pick up there, chapter 12, verse 14, next time.